Hello, and welcome to the June edition of Coffee with the Pastors. I'm Pastor Daniel Hanson, joined here today by Pastor Beverly Butler and Pastor Dan Gerrietts. We've got our favorite beverages with us today. We invite you to grab whatever your favorite beverage is and join us for a conversation this day. Happy June. Uh, I am a firm believer that June is one of the greatest months in all of the 12 months. I may be a little bit biased because my own birthday falls in the month of June. But
Oh,
summer
yeah.
vacation starts, baseball's in full season, the garden is looking good. June is just a good time of year. So, how are each of you enjoying this summer season as we quickly, I think, officially turn the page from spring to summer because that's not until later in June. But how are you enjoying this summer season?
Great. I love watching things grow.
Hmm.
And it's a few things that I planted and a lot of other things I didn't plant, but they're still growing.
Yeah, we've had rain and so stuff really is growing too. It's really been a June for growth. Yeah, it's good. It's a good month. I like the days being long. I like lots of sunshine, and this is maximum time for that. We kind of peak out here in a little bit, so it's fun. Fun to have long days. The sun coming up at what, 5? Something like that.
Before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
4. Yeah.
Oh, it's getting light earlier than 5, but I'm not sure on the actual sunrise.
Yeah.
But you think of it, if we didn't have daylight savings time, it would be light really early, you
Yeah.
know?
Right.
So,
Yeah. Really early.
I often wondered this is way out in left field, but I hear birds singing at like 4 o'clock in the morning some mornings. I was like, what's their circadian rhythm? Like, what times are they getting up and going to bed? And maybe in the summertime they are just awake 18 or 20 hours during the day. But yeah, it has been fun to watch things grow in this season. It's been a nice, we've gotten timely rains. We've had lots of warm weather, so lots of happy plants are out in my garden and out in my backyard. Uh, Similar to you, Pastor Beverly, I'm enjoying watching what I planted grow, but then also what God planted is also growing in lots of places. And so it's fun to see how perennials have a life of their own and spread in different places. And
I thought you were talking about weeds.
well, you
true.
know, the deep question is I actually I sent something into Iowa State Extension because I didn't know what it was. And I identified it as a flower because it was beautiful. They identified it as a weed because it's deeply invasive and spreads very quickly. And so, as a farmer once said, a weed is a misplaced plant.
Mhm.
And I thought about that. But yes, I have lots of weeds back there too. But the bugs like the weeds for pollinating too. So.
True, true.
Well, we are seeking to grow not just plants in this season, but continuing to grow in our own spiritual life. And part of our preaching series that we are sharing for the rest of the month of June and into the month of July is a sermon series called Conversations with God. So I thought we could do, we're 1 week in at this point, where we'll be 2 weeks in the weekend that our podcast comes out. But I thought we could, if you haven't been to worship yet this summer, we could share a little bit about this sermon series, what people have to look forward to the rest of the series, because I think it's an interesting theme that we're exploring in this conversation with God. Because as we look at these different stories, many from the Old Testament, but not all of them, we see God communicating with the people of God, in some cases, specifically with Israel, specifically with Gentiles, people outside of Israel, in some really unique ways. Sometimes it's a really direct dialogue. It's kind of a back and forth, thus says the Lord. And other times it's very subtle. Sometimes there's no verbal words exchanged. Sometimes it's through action. And what I'm at least excited about in this series is I think this might broaden our imagination for how is God talking to us today, right? Because I know there are times I wish God would just get on the loudspeaker and say, "Hey, this is what I want you to do," but that doesn't always seem to be the way that God chooses to work. But we see throughout the witness of Scripture these rich stories and rich traditions where God has spoken and communicated with God's people. And so, Pastor Dan, maybe you could share a few of the highlighted scriptures that we're going to be covering in the weeks ahead, so that people have an overview of what's coming up over these next 6, 7 weeks.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Should we share how we came up with this? Should we give a glimpse behind
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
so
Absolutely.
so we were looking at doing a summer series. We wanted to start it the Sunday after Pentecost, and we were kind of looking through the readings, and like it was Luke, right? This summer we're doing, yeah, we would have been in a lot of Luke, but the problem was back in Lent we did a lot of these same stories from Luke because we followed Peter, right? Wasn't that this year? Wasn't that
That was 2 years ago.
that was 2 years? What did we
Yeah.
do this year? I don't remember.
Uh-oh.
What was it? None of
It
us
was
remember.
it was
We were in Luke though.
yes, we're definitely in Luke's gospel. Yes.
Clearly a very memorable series. And but we were looking through the gospel readings for the summer and we're like, we've done all of these stories. We've already kind of looked at these gospel readings. And so we're like, well, then let's look at some of the Old Testament readings. And a lot of them between the regular lectionary assigned Old Testament or the semi-continuous, which is without totally nerding out on the lectionary, it's kind of an alternative set of readings, right, for each assigned weekends. We saw in this set of stories a whole bunch of situations or examples of people having conversation or some type of give and take with God. And we just thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. That might be the one thing they all have in common. Some of these stories are familiar. Some of them are not ones that we read typically in a church year when we're following the lectionary. So just to kind of go through them, last weekend, June 14th, 15th, we looked at Proverbs 8, and in particular in that chapter, the idea of wisdom. Wisdom is kind of a divine figure, right? Or a representation of God in some ways, and how wisdom gets recast or defined in different ways. And I thought just again, not to fluff totally, but Pastor Daniel, the sermon last week, and I said to you after Sunday, man, to do a sermon on wisdom in about 15 minutes, that is a tall order. And I just thought you did a fantastic job with that, explaining it's about knowledge, it's about insight, but it's also about something deeper in God's presence in that. And I just thought you really explained that well. This weekend we get First Kings 19, the story of Elijah hiding in the cave, and then God calling him out to see God or to hear God pass by. And it's God is not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in the still small voice or in the silence, depending on how you translate that little bit of Hebrew. And so we're looking at that and God speaking through the silence, which is a really fascinating topic, particularly for 21st century Americans who don't have much silence in our lives, right? Next weekend, last weekend in June, we'll look at 2 Kings 2, Elijah's ascending to heaven. And there are some themes of communication that happen within that memorable story of Elijah's kind of the end of his story. The week after that, we'll look at the healing of Naaman, the army commander. And there's some give and take there with God. Is God going to act? Who is going to God act to? And the justice of insider, outsider, and how God kind of communicates through that. Then we go for a couple of weeks. We're going to be in Amos, which is a book that we don't often spend a lot of time in worship. Amos 7, God talks about Israel using the image of a plumb line, that Israel has lost their way. They've kind of gotten off of center. And so God is going to do something about that. And we get to see that conversation with the prophet and God's people and God. And then the very next chapter, there's another image kind of along the same lines where God compares Israel to a basket of ripe fruit. It's time for something to be done with them. And so we'll look at that week. And then we'll wrap everything up the end of July, jumping into the gospel, Luke 11, where Jesus teaches the disciples and us how to pray using basically the Lord's Prayer. And so a very formulaic prayer that Jesus prescribes to say, if you want to pray, pray like this. So it's really, I think, a fun series in part because of, just as you said, the huge diversity of ways that God speaks, sometimes through individuals, sometimes just a voice or the word of the Lord comes, sometimes through things like fire and cloud or earthquake, silence. And wonderful for us to think about in our lives in modern times. How do we hear God? And how do we really understand God speaking to us? How do we figure out if it's God or something else? I think it's really fun. And just already early on, led Bible studies earlier this week, and great conversation, great questions that people are raising out of this.
Well, stay tuned. Come to worship over these next couple of weeks to see how these stories unfold. Uh, I checked quick. Our Lenten series was everything in between,
Oh,
finding God
that's
in the middle, right? Which I think this is a perfect example of how often themes are daily bread, right? They nourish us in a season, and then we keep going.
that's
But
a nice. That's very nice. Yes.
uh,
Yes,
well,
very true.
I thought today we could. um, talk not necessarily specifically about the stories that are coming up, unless there's a certain something about we want to highlight about one of those. But we could talk more broadly about what does it mean to converse with God? What does it mean to talk to God? On the one hand, we might be talking about prayer. On the other hand, as I remember working at summer camp for a summer, we did the whole Bible study was about prayer. And by the end of the week, I was less sure I knew what prayer was than when I started because we had expanded. I had such a narrow definition of what prayer was that as we continued to explore more and more deeply, right, it expanded beyond this now I lay me down to sleep, our Father who art in heaven world to all the different ways through actions and through words that we can communicate with God. And so I thought we could spend some time just chatting about our own experiences of talking with God, and knowing that those are simply our own experiences, and that we're wrestling with a lot of the same big questions that everyone else is wrestling with in this on the one hand challenge of hearing God's voice, on the other hand of this very simple medium that God has offered to always be listening. So I'm curious to kick us off. Do you have a favorite way to, and here's our many different options: pray, talk to God, converse with God. So we're thinking about this very broadly. Do you have a favorite medium that has guided you? Doesn't need to be a practice you're using now necessarily, but at a time in life it's been especially helpful. And I can kick off to give you a second.
Okay.
Uh, I have found I have found the uh, I like prayers that are have someone else's written. Like I have my own prayer world where I'm talking directly with God, but I find the language of tradition to be very helpful in bringing words to my own communication. So there was a season I did the Book of Common Prayer as a kind of the daily hours, um, and
And explain
that
what that is, because I'm not sure everybody knows what that is.
yeah, yeah. So I think our Anglican friends, right, have adapted. I think it was originally a Roman Catholic practice of you would pray during certain times of the day, and it was fully prescribed. Like it was all you could have your full year of prayer in this nice little book. There's one for each and every day. So there's a morning prayer, there's an evening prayer. I think if you do the full liturgy of the hours, there's even some throughout the day. I like to do morning and evening prayer. But for me, it created a structure, right? Like now is a good time to pray, right? And there was something special about, for me, praying as a community, right? Because I knew other people were sharing in these words, even though I was praying individually. And it gave language because it'd be like, what do I need to talk about God? I felt like I had a just was naming a laundry list. Not a bad thing, but the depth of the tradition allowed me to talk to God in ways that I couldn't think of by myself. So that was one way that was very structured, and I would put in the very traditional sense of prayer. The other is as I found myself in life in more challenging times, whether that's seasons of grief or seasons of uncertainty, I have found music to be a very powerful way to talk with God. I'll go for walks, um, often at dusk, right, or at night, and to hear particular. I have a prayer list of different things, and I'm amazed at how that gives me language to express to God either the anguish of my heart, the longing for something to happen, the joy of something happening in a season. Um, but I found both of those modes to be one's interesting enough, more contemporary music, uh, and one is more traditional liturgy of the hours. And so both have given language that I couldn't find myself. So I found those to be helpful practices.
Yeah. I've always found a diversity of prayers to be helpful. There are times in my life I very much like formulaic prayers. You know, I think having my call to ministry came when I was in a time that I was spending a lot of time with people who came from less liturgical traditions. People had grown up in Baptist churches and evangelical churches and that kind of thing. And there was sometimes from some of those folks this sense that to use a pre-written formula kind of prayer was sort of lacking in depth and spirituality. And I think that's because in those traditions, praying from the heart is so deeply valued, and that you pray that the Spirit, it's important that you let the Spirit speak through you and what needs to be said in that moment. And I think there's a time and a place for that. There's times I love to pray that way. When you have a really deep conversation with somebody, and you need to together join your hearts together in prayer in a way that speaks from that conversation you've had or this kind of experience, this moment that you've had. I love to pray that way. I'm shocked at times at sometimes the words that come in those moments, and give the Spirit a lot of credit for that. But I love in corporate worship well phrased, well written prayers, sometimes prayers that have been used over and over through the ages, not only because of their beauty and the great care that was put into writing them, but just this idea that the same people have spoken those words in prayer to God for generations. I think that's beautiful. And it's kind of like that old thing we talk a lot about in our tradition of getting to wade into this river of the faithful that just kind of continues to flow by. So I like that too. But for me, I think sometimes the most powerful way of praying for me is singing.
Hmm.
Singing, there's something about the act of singing that's deeply spiritual. It connects, for me, mind, body, and heart. And some of the texts that you sing in choirs or as individuals or hymns, even on Sunday or Saturday, other times are are just beautiful and wonderful prayers to God. And sometimes, like you were talking about with the Psalms or the Common Book of Prayer, are just they put voice to feelings you didn't even realize,
Mm.
things that you needed to say. And so, yeah, that might be one of my favorite ways. And Luther said famously, whether he actually said it or not, we don't know, but he is credited with saying, "He who sings prays twice." And
Mm.
remember that was on the wall of our college choir room at Augustana when I was a student.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
Very
What about
cool.
you, Beverly? What would you say?
Well, I pray for others at length, and so that's one type of conversing with God. I'm just naming folks and lifting them up, and then sitting in silence through the method of centering prayer. Although there's um, no idea that I am necessarily good at it, and that's not the idea of it. So my mind runs, but I do try to do some sitting, particularly morning, intend to in the evening, but don't always get to that. And then I just feel like it's an ongoing conversation, just a sense of God with me and talking, not necessarily out loud by any means, but just daily, just the day-to-day, everyday stuff. And then, of course, the more help me God situations. um, yeah, and I am aware, especially appreciate the how would you say it? I guess ecumenical nature of the Lord's Prayer.
Mm.
Praying, especially at funerals that are not necessarily um, church funerals, and yet when we pray the Lord's Prayer, people from various traditions join in,
Hmm.
um, and that's just encourages me to know that we are one in the Spirit.
Hmm.
Hmm.
What
Yeah.
is it about praying in silence or sitting in silence? What is it about that that's important for you? Because I think that's a kind of prayer that a lot of Lutherans, at least, we haven't always um, tended to as much as some other forms.
Well, and I hadn't either, I must say. My father became acquainted with the centering prayer and was a part of a group where he lived in Rochester, Minnesota. And I would go with him when I was visiting, but I I didn't have the time, I guess, because he'd invite me even to sit with him when he'd visit me. Well, I'm going to do my centering prayer now. Do you want to join me? Oh, no, no, I've got too much to do. Well, after he passed away, and then I learned about the centering prayer group here at Trinity, I started coming to discover what has been very meaningful. It I think it's just allowing space without sound. Of course, my mind goes pretty quickly on lots of things, but it's quiet. And it's not having something to focus on, just one's breathing and, maybe a word, a sacred word to bring you back from your wandering mind. But um, yeah, it's become, and it does need to be a pattern, I think, and not a choice. Shall I do it today? No. Oh, I will or I won't. So the morning is a pattern for me. The evening has become too much of a choice. But they say once a day is maintenance, spiritual maintenance. Twice a day is spiritual growth. So
Mm.
I've slipped away a little bit from the twice a day, but yeah, it's. I don't know how to say. I would miss it very much if I wasn't doing it because it gives a framework for the day and just a time to sit and know I'm sitting in God's presence. I don't have to do or be or say anything particular.
Mm.
Yeah.
I love that image
Yeah.
of just sitting in God's presence.
Well,
Thanks
I
for
think
asking because I don't usually have to think about why I'm doing it now, but it's and I think like many things, a habit is so important. Um, because it allows you not to have to think about it, to decide, I guess. It's what we do.
Mhm.
I remember years ago, a family where the church I was serving, they were every Sunday family. And the dad told me once his daughter, I don't know, early elementary, upper elementary, she said to him once, Dad, how do people decide what Sunday they're going to come to church if they don't come every week? Like,
Mm.
how do you decide? And that you could say that about prayer too, if it isn't part of a regular habit. How do we decide um, when to be open to that
Yeah.
presence in that way?
I mean, it really is in that way. There's a discipline kind of, not a, I mean, discipline
Yeah,
sounds like a harsh
no,
word, but in terms of like
that's what it
something we
is.
practice, right?
Yeah,
It's a
yeah.
practice. And like anything else, if you don't practice it regularly, then it's something that isn't as full a part of your life as it could be, or it couldn't shape
Hmm.
you in the way that it might, right? And I think that's probably true for any kind of prayer, whether we're talking about centering prayer or Lectio Divina or dinner prayer or prayer and
Hmm.
worship or whatever it is. There is that kind of sense of it. It's something that we practice, and so you have to commit to it in a way that is sometimes, yeah, it requires something of us. It asks something of us.
I think that's w- one unique thing about Christianity is that we don't have across multi-denominations uh, a particular discipline that we share. I think of some other religions that there are expectations of certain disciplines and practices, and in Christianity, it's kind of choose your own adventure, right? Which there's lots of wonderful freedom in that because then it's
Hmm.
not an obligation. Um, but I've sometimes lamented that we don't have a shared Lutheran spiritual discipline around these things, and I think that's interesting. We kind of shape our own, but it's made me curious about what if we as a congregation, right, committed to a certain discipline for a season or something like that? What would that feel like? I don't know. Um, but I was in Germany for a summer and had lots of classmates at the school who were Muslim, and so they had, I mean, 5 times a day you stopped what you were doing, and there was prayer time. Middle class, like you just that was what you did. And in some ways, while it was a very different prayer tradition than my own, I admired their commitment to this is what we do to be in communion with our God. So. Um, yeah, there's something to crafting one's own discipline, right? One's own practice, one's own habit of these conversations. The other thing, as you were talking, Beverly, that was interesting to me is as I think about as I'm talking with others, uh, if I talk, just talk, 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 it's not really a conversation, right? Because it's a one-way street, right? And how often in my own prayer life, it's me telling God what I think should be up and then moving on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard, right? Because it's not the same as talking to a person, who's right there in front of you and like a human being. But there is something to I've often wondered, am I open to listening when God might want to speak? Or have I said, okay, I got my two, I made the requests have been made. It's time to move on to the next activity for the
Mm-hmm.
day. And thinking about prayer as conversation causes me to slow down a little bit and say, do I need some time with silence? Do I need some time with scripture? How am I going to listen for what God might respond? If we say God is going to be faithful and respond, do we stick around long enough to listen for what that could be like? Centering prayer sounds like one practice to be open to um,
Mm-hmm.
to slow down a little bit.
In talking with the Bible studies this week, at that story of Elijah and the God speaking in the silence or the still small voice, it was interesting to listen to some of our Bible study participants talk about the ways in their everyday routines that they have created space for silence. Now, it may not be quite as directed and intentional as centering prayer, but I was surprised by the number of people who say, sitting with my cup of coffee on the porch every morning with no distractions, no, just
Mm-hmm.
drinking and looking. Um, that's important. Or people saying, being in the car and not having the radio on, not having any other, that's important, and they recognize that need to create space for, and I think I would say for God to be
Mm-hmm.
present, for your thoughts to wander, for you to think about what your needs are, what you're feeling, what you're facing, what you're rejoicing or celebrating about. There is something about that is not only spiritual but seems to be helpful for us as human beings. And
Hmm.
it just made me reflect on like, am I doing that enough, or am I, yeah, just doing the talking?
Hmm.
Do we expect to hear from God?
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
And do we expect to? And then do we really want to? Uh,
Those are
you
two
know,
different and very important questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Daniel, your question, God, what do you want me to do? And sometimes I'm like, I don't know that I want to hear the answer to that. If it would push me out of my comfort zone, I'm not sure, God. I can think of times when I felt, looking back, I really felt it was God nudging me to make a phone call or stop in and see someone, and I had rational reasons to excuse myself. Um, and then several times, the person passed away the next day or by the next day. It's like, okay, God was trying to give me a little nudge in that direction, and I decided not to take it because whatever. I mean, how do we know? How do we know? Like, is it God saying to do something? When the man asked Jesus, "What should I do to inherit eternal life?" You know, he had all the right answers, but then what he was lacking was, truly being able to to be the neighbor to someone else. I have all these things. That's one story, and then another one was when Jesus said, "Leave everything you have and come follow me." Well, do we really want to do that? Well, then we have reasons why that doesn't apply to us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
There's a deep wrestling. Yeah. Do we
yeah.
do we expect to hear from God? Is it easier to not listen because we're not
Mhm.
disappointed if we don't hear? Do we not want to know what the answer is and how that might push us out of our comfort zone? Right.
Mhm.
That's the vulnerability of prayer. And it's with people too, as we have like I think that's an interesting comparison is sometimes we might not ask people questions because we don't want the answer. Right.
Mhm.
Um,
Right.
Well, and
Right.
sometimes when we are discerning, is God speaking? I think it's helpful to think about what are the processes that we use for discerning that. And I
Mhm.
think we've talked about it before, but I think sometimes in modern American Christianity, in some places and times, there are people who say, God said to me this, and
Mhm.
therefore I'm going this way, or we're going this way, we're going to do
Mhm.
this. In other traditions, and I would include ours in that, communal discernment is a huge part of individual discernment, right? And in some traditions, there's hardly any individual discernment at all. Everything is group discernment. You always
Mhm.
are doing discerning what is God saying as a group. And I would say, in ours, I think there's this sense of we can individually say, oh, I think God is calling us or calling me to do this, but it's a really healthy and helpful thing a lot of times to sit with people who know you well, friends, family, church members, church communities, and go, this is what I'm hearing from
Mhm.
God, or this is the sense I'm having when I'm being drawn, led, whatever language you want to use. Does that make sense in light of the gospel, in light of
Hmm.
who Jesus is, in light of everything we know about how God works? Does that make sense? I was jogging with the Bible study. I said, I could sit on Sunday morning and go, I think God is calling Trinity to buy me a Corvette convertible. And I bet that if I took that to the congregation, there might be some people that would say, let's discern that together, right? Like maybe not, right? And that's beautiful and that's important because otherwise we can get in some dangerous places if we decide God has spoken and we don't have any way to really test that.
Yeah, right. And I know in my own experience, right, and some people struggling to discern that, is that as they maybe are actually hearing voices, right, and wondering, is this God speaking to me? Um, is this explained by something else, right? Is this a mental illness that's manifesting as hearing voices? Is this my subconscious, right, that is speaking to me in this moment? What is that voice? And to have conversation partners with that is essential, right? Because how many horrible stories have we heard of people doing atrocities, harming themselves or others, just doing things that were not in the interest of the community and pretty clearly with communal discernment is not
Mhm.
God's voice.
Mhm.
Um, but that's part of this challenge, right? And I think there's a little bit of, at least for me, vulnerability and a little fear sometimes of, did I hear something? What was that? What does that mean? But I think it's just good to name that, right? That's why we have a community to share that in, and that's why we have each other to even call each other out sometimes, say, I don't know if that's God's voice.
Mhm.
If that's God's voice, what does that mean for this? And
Or even when our voices begin to just be demeaning to ourselves, right? I mean, sometimes the
Mhm.
tapes
mm,
in our heads can play things that are really not helpful, but they become so loud and that we start to sort of, believe them. And that's a place where community, in a little less extreme way, can go, that is not the good news of Jesus Christ for you. That
hmm
says that you are loved and you are beloved, not by what you do or not do, not how you performed on that test or how you did with this thing at work or how this relationship is going, that your value is deeper than that, right? And that becomes a way that God speaks
mm.
too, speaks good news to us in very specific ways. Sometimes, but we need each other to do that. Sometimes we can do that on our own, but sometimes we really need somebody else to speak that to us, remind
Well,
us.
and that touches on God speaking through other people to us,
Mm.
and are we willing to hear, or do we write off God can't be speaking through them because somehow,
Oh,
I don't know, they may
they're not the
be.
right kind of person,
Yeah,
or
that's
yeah.
right. That's right. And yet it could be that God chooses all of us to work through us to touch others' lives.
Mm.
So it could be, are we listening to somebody else who really is giving us, a word of grace and love, and we're, not willing to receive that because, yeah, it doesn't fit our image. I
Yeah.
remember my dad telling me when he was probably maybe in high school, even younger, that folks in his church would say to him, we think God is calling you into the ministry. And he brushed it off because he wanted God to call him directly with a dramatic call and not through other people's sense of who he was. So how do we decide? How do we and do we brush off where God is actually working through someone else to touch us?
Yeah,
You
do we
know,
make demands on how God is going to speak to us,
right.
Mm.
right? And
It
go,
has
this
to
is
be
the only
this way.
way that it's gonna,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. I don't know. I think God speaks sometimes through, like a gut ache or just a feeling of vulnerability and
Mm-hmm.
unsettledness, right? I mean, sometimes in my life that has been a way that I'm like, oh, there's something happening, but I too have to be tuned to that a little bit, or I just go,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, brush it aside and try to move on. Yeah.
And the more we get to know ourselves and our own reactions, then we can also kind of figure out, is something going on here? I remember years ago hearing a woman who had heard a group speak about Witness for Peace in Nicaragua. I think this was probably in the 70s, 80s, maybe. And she said she heard this speaker and she went home and she just jumped into house cleaning, like a fervent house cleaning. And then it occurred to her that's what she does when she's trying to resist something that God is calling her to do. Like,
Hmm.
oh, this is what I'm doing. So she
Mm.
went and had
Wow.
an experience, powerful experience. So, we know ourselves a little better and we say, oh, okay, I'm okay. That's very interesting. Why am I reacting that way? What's going on here?
Hmm.
Yeah, it's a great story.
Hmm.
Yeah, are there other stories you have of a time where you felt like God has communicated to you, or you've know someone who you felt like God communicated, and maybe that was through words and speaking, maybe that was through this innate sense of just a sense of God's presence and doing something. Um, I think there's a whole breadth and depth of these stories that go from pretty extraordinary, kind of miraculous kind of stories to very ordinary, mundane, and God's working in all of those. But any examples you can think of that would be interesting to share with those listening today?
I think, and maybe not just us as pastors, but we're privileged to hear people's stories of experiences with God's presence that they're afraid to share with others because they seem so, how can this be? I remember years ago a parishioner telling me about the time when she saw Jesus, um, who came to her to assure her to reassure her about a family member's situation, and her description of it, I mean, it was very powerful. But she was afraid to share that in general with others. I mean, it gave her great strength and in her faith, but are we afraid? Because when we share those things, people might think something, we're weird or whatever. But I get to hear some of those stories at the hospital, people's experiences of when a loved one was dying, and then what that person's conversation was, maybe conversation with someone who had already died, and the person sharing it was witness to that, and how it affirmed their faith
Hmm.
and God's presence with them at that time. And I at times will feel like I've heard just out of the blue something that really I needed to hear. It was like a word of encouragement or comfort or guidance, and when it just comes really kind of unbidden, and seems to then resonate with the heart, it's like, oh, okay. Let me pay attention to that. Is that from God through a voice from my past? Maybe it was reassurance of something that my mom or dad would have said, and I'm remembering that. I don't know, but if it feels like it really connects, seems to be what is needed at that moment, then I'm like, okay, thank you, thank you. That helps.
Yeah, I too, I think it is one of the privileges, Beverly, what you said about being a person that seemed to be a little more safe sometimes to share those stories of
Mhm.
people's direct encounters or kind of theophanies, right, with God
Mhm.
that in the West, in this time and place, we're not too open to as a culture. There are other cultures in the world right now where those kinds of experience would be very accepted and people
Mhm.
wouldn't think at all about. I remember a seminary professor telling the story of a good friend of his in Papua New Guinea who had the experience of being visited one night in his office by a friend of his. They sat down, they ate, or they sat down and they talked for probably an hour. They ate beetle nut, which is kind of a snack in this particular area, and then the friend got up and left, and then the seminary professor of mine, his friend who had but was in the office, said he learned that that person that had come to visit him had died earlier that day.
Hmm.
And for me, I'm listening to the story going, that's crazy. I don't even have the framework to make that story fit. But the point that my professor was making in telling this is, in that culture, time and place, nobody was concerned about the fact. He said, my friend wasn't worried about the fact that his friend who had died was sitting in his office talking and eating betel nut with him. His question about it was, in light of the resurrection and what we believe as Christians, how did that work? That he was sitting there when he's,
Mm.
supposedly raised with Christ. That was what he was wrestling with,
Hmm.
not with how does a dead person sit in the flesh in my office. I'm like, wow. Yeah. So I think we are often afraid to share those kinds of encounters
Mhm.
when they happen because we don't think it's rational. And yet the scriptures are full of encounters that are very hard to explain. So when people say those kinds of things to me, I mean, it's very tempting to be quick to judge whatever their experience is and go, well, yeah, that probably is true. That probably is God, or that probably isn't. But I try to hold back and go, I don't know what to make of that. What does it mean for you? What
Hmm.
meaning does it take in your life? And kind of go there instead. I think that leads to far more interesting conversations than rather, trying to figure out whether or not we think it's possible or not. So I mean, in my own life, I've had a couple of those experiences, and I'm like, I don't know really what to make of that. But if the message that was given through them seems helpful and healthy,
Mhm.
then I just try not to wrestle too much with what's the mechanism of it, or is it of God? Just take it as a gift, whatever it is, and let it be.
We
Yeah.
get into our minds of judging so much, at least, I do, trying to figure out, well, just, yeah, accept it if it's a good thing. Accept it, receive it, thank God for it. Thank God for it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had an experience like that in college. I had been in Europe, and that was my first experience of not rural Iowa. And so it was this collision of culture and religion and thought. And I remember leaving Europe just deeply questioning everything. And truth be told, of all the people I encountered there, the non-Christians were a lot more Christian than the Christians I knew, and frankly, the Muslims were a lot more Christian than the Christians I knew. And so I didn't know what I believed as I left. And like this is kind of a crisis because I was like going to be a pastor.
Yeah.
Kind of matters if you subscribe to the teachings anymore. And the big deal for me was like, was resurrection still a thing? Like, does that
Mm-hmm.
actually happen? And I was in the cemetery um, visiting my grandparents, who were both deceased, very faithful people, always people I had come to. Felt like a veiled space, a thin space of, and um, I remember thinking to myself, well, if resurrection isn't true, they're just dead, right? This is where their bodies are, and that's it. Or there's something more. And I felt nothing. Like I felt no sense of yes, no. I just felt absolutely nothing. Um, so I was kind of discouraged because I was kind of hoping Grandpa and Grandma would help me out a little bit. And I got in the car to drive away, and I had had a CD playing that I wasn't listening to because I was kind of distressed as I was going to the cemetery. And the first words of the song as the car started were, "He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave." Now, I'd have friends who would explain that as pure chance, pure luck. Maybe it was. I don't know. But I have tried to receive it as I like the language you use. That's a gift. For me, that was
Mm-hmm.
God saying, "You're on the right path. I'm not going to answer any more of your questions right now, but keep going on this path." And as I talked with other pastors about all my questions, right, they were very affirmative, saying, "You're asking all the right questions," but I needed a little nudge in that moment to know that it was okay to ask those questions and be. Um, I don't think God has ever spoken to me again that clearly, or like it's always been a nudge or a feeling. But right, you hold on to those moments, whether they're part
Mm-hmm.
of your story, whether they're part of someone else's story, because it makes it more real, right? It makes it tangible. Which I think is the great challenge, right? Is that in all of our experiences, we've had different experiences, right? Some of us have had really profound experiences that ground us, and some of us lament that we haven't had experiences that are grounding us in ways that have grounded others. And I think that's just worth naming, right? Because as Um, as I think if there's one theme we can pick up is that how God chooses to speak to us is not in our realm to control, right? That this is how God is communicating is a mystery, right? We can't measure it, we can't identify it, we can't judge it, right? It comes to us through all these different mediums, and sometimes that's really hard because we could really use some clear guidance, and other times it works out, but
When it kind of gets into,
Maybe there's lots of little things that we're just missing.
hmm,
That God is sending to us all the time. You
hmm,
know, and it could be, that we're just overlooking a lot of the messages from God because it's not big enough or dramatic enough or something.
yeah. I mean, have we said, God, I want to hear this way, right? And I'm not
Mhm.
open to the other ways that God is speaking. I've learned in my own house that there are many things that I don't hear that are being spoken to me. And right, are we listening, right? And it's hard, right? Even if you're trying to listen, right? You miss out on the things.
yeah,
Um,
is it possible we're gifted differently in that way? I mean, we talk about different spiritual gifts and different ways that we're gifted to live and to serve with God in the world, but is being able to pray or listen and discern, is that a spiritual gift that some people have in greater
mm,
measure than others? I mean, I've always
mm,
kind of believed that because it just seems from experience there are certain people that have the ability to discern what's happening sooner or with more sensitivity than others. I don't know. Not that that ranks or makes people higher or lower in the spiritual chain, but I think it's more just about the diversity of gifts that people have. That there seem to be people who are really gifted in prayer,
mm,
and both the ability to pray for others, but also the ability to hear well. And again, that's where community I think is so important, right? That it just doesn't become, well, good for that person, they get that gift. No, if we think about it as the body of Christ, as Paul talks about, then those people can be a gift to others, just as people with different gifts can be a gift to them as we share
mm.
life together.
That's beautiful. Well, maybe the gift we leave can close out today is this gift that God has promised to hear our prayers, right? That the God that is revealed to us in Scripture and embodied in Jesus is a God with a listening ear, a God who cares about what is going on in our world and in our lives, and a God who longs to be in conversation, communion, and in relationship with us. And so I'm excited to explore that more deeply with you all and with Trinity this summer. So, any closing thoughts that we want to share today?
Just that there is also a devotional with this series.
Yes.
Danny Vogel on our team has written a weekly devotional that's really simple and really focused. It's often like an activity that ties into the kind of the main theme that helps individuals or groups of people, families even, practice a little bit of what we're talking about each week. And so it can be found in the bulletin each week in worship. It's also on our website underneath the Conversations with God page. Those are posted each week. Encourage you to check them out. They're really well done. They're really, really cool.
Awesome. Well, thanks for tuning in. We will look forward to touching base again in the future, but God's blessings and blessings in this great season of summer. Take care. We'll see you next time.
Happy listening.